On March 18, 1945, in the frost-covered fields outside Remagen, Germany, a 23-year-old American corporal named Thomas Harwell crouched behind a shattered stone wall, his hands wrapped around something his entire platoon had mocked for weeks. It looked like a collection of mason jars wrapped in burlap and wire, filled with a murky liquid that resembled nothing more than dirty dishwater. His sergeant had called it junk. His squad mates had nicknamed it Harwell's magic potion. One private had laughed so hard he nearly fell off his bunk when Tommy first showed them his creation. But in 27 seconds, that laughter would be replaced by something else entirely: awe. Because what Thomas Harwell held in his hands wasn't a joke. It was about to become the most effective anti-armor weapon his unit had ever seen, and he hadn't fired a single bullet. This is the true story of the soldier they ridiculed for brewing fake smoke in glass jars, right up until the moment his homemade concoction blinded an entire platoon of German panzer tanks and changed the way infantry thought about chemical warfare. Thomas Harwell never planned to be a soldier. Before the war, he had been studying chemistry at a small college in Ohio, fascinated by reactions, compounds, and the invisible forces that held matter together. He wasn't particularly strong, wasn't particularly brave, and when he was drafted in the spring of 1943, his drill instructors wondered aloud if the Army had scraped the bottom of the recruitment barrel. But Tommy had something most soldiers didn't. He understood chemistry the way a mechanic understands engines. He could look at a formula and see how it breathed, how it moved, how it could be weaponized. During basic training at Fort Dix, he noticed something that bothered him. The standard-issue smoke grenades, the ones designed to provide cover for advancing troops, were inconsistent. Some worked beautifully, others fizzled out in seconds, and all of them required resupply, which in the chaos of the European theater often meant going without. Tommy started experimenting in secret, using materials he scrounged from the base, discarded glass containers, cleaning chemicals, even agricultural supplies from nearby farms. He began testing smoke-producing reactions. His bunkmates thought he was wasting his time. The Army already had smoke grenades. What could one college dropout possibly improve? By the winter of 1944, Tommy's unit, the 7th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division, had pushed deep into Germany. The fighting was brutal, urban combat, house to house, street to street, and increasingly they were running into German armor, panzer tanks that could shred an infantry position in minutes. The problem was simple but deadly. American infantry had bazookas and anti-tank rifles, but those required line of sight and nerves of steel. Smoke grenades could provide cover, but the standard models, the M18 series, burned for less than 2 minutes and produced inconsistent coverage. Tommy had watched 3 men die trying to cross an open square in Aachen because their smoke screen dissipated too quickly. That's when he started thinking differently. What if the smoke wasn't just for cover? What if it could be a weapon itself? Tommy's breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a German chemical grenade he'd found in a captured bunker. The Blendkörper, literally blinding body in German, was a glass sphere filled with titanium tetrachloride, a chemical that reacted violently with moisture in the air to produce thick, choking smoke. The Germans used them to blind tank crews and pillbox defenders. But the German version had limitations. It required high humidity to work effectively. The glass was fragile and often broke prematurely. And most importantly, it was in short supply on both sides of the front line. Tommy thought he could do better. Using his chemistry background, he began experimenting with different compounds. He scavenged titanium tetrachloride from destroyed German grenades. He mixed it with calcium chloride and other moisture-attracting agents to ensure the reaction would work even in dry conditions. He added zinc chloride to make the smoke thicker, more persistent, more blinding. And then came the controversial part. He added phosphorus compounds, not white phosphorus, which was already in use and incredibly dangerous, but a modified mixture that would make the smoke burn hotter and longer without the same risk of uncontrolled fires. He stored his mixtures in mason jars because that's all he could find. He wrapped them in burlap soaked in kerosene so they would ignite on impact. He attached simple fuses made from blasting cord. The result looked absolutely ridiculous. like something a high school student might build for a science fair. When he showed his creation to his squad in early March, they laughed until they cried. Sergeant McKinley picked one up, turned it over in his hands, and said, "Harwell, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. You want us to throw pickle jars at panzers?" Another soldier chimed in. "What's next, Tommy? Gonna defeat Hitler with your grandmother's canning recipes?" Even the company commander, Captain Brennan, was skeptical. "Corporal, I appreciate initiative, but we have regulations for a reason. Those mason jars could shatter in your pack. That mixture could be unstable, and frankly, it looks like something that belongs in a trash heap, not on a battlefield." But Tommy persisted. He asked for permission to test them in a controlled environment. Brennan, perhaps out of pity or curiosity, agreed. Tommy set up targets in an abandoned quarry, simulated tank positions, bunker entrances, and observation posts. When he threw his first jar, the result was immediate and dramatic. The glass shattered, the mixture ignited, and within seconds, a cloud of dense, choking, white smoke erupted across the entire test area. It wasn't like regular smoke. This was thick, persistent, and completely opaque. It clung to surfaces. It didn't dissipate in the wind, and it lasted for over 4 minutes, more than twice as long as standard smoke grenades. Brennan watched in silence. Then he turned to Tommy and said, "Make more." By mid-March, the Allies had achieved the impossible. They had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the last intact bridge across the Rhine River. It was a strategic miracle, a gateway into the heart of Germany. But the Germans weren't giving it up without a fight. For 3 days, German forces launched desperate counterattacks, trying to destroy the bridge or drive the Americans back across the river. Infantry, artillery, and increasingly armored divisions. Panzer tanks rolled toward the bridgehead in waves, determined to cut off the American advance. Tommy's unit was part of the defensive perimeter on the eastern side of the bridge. Their position was dangerously exposed, a shallow trench line across open farmland with almost no cover. Intelligence reports warned them that a German armored platoon, at least 5 Panzer, 4 tanks, was moving toward their position at dawn. The men were terrified. Bazookas were effective, but only at close range, and crossing open ground to get close enough was suicidal. Artillery support was tied up supporting other sectors. Air support was grounded by heavy fog. They were on their own. That night, Tommy approached Sergeant McKinley with a plan. He had made 23 of his homemade smoke jars, enough to create a massive smoke barrier between their position and the advancing tanks. But more than that, if they could throw the jars directly onto the tanks, the smoke would be so thick and so persistent that the crews would be completely blind, unable to see their targets, unable to coordinate, maybe even unable to breathe. McKinley looked at the jars, then at Tommy, then back at the jars. "You really think this'll work?" Tommy nodded. "I know it will." McKinley sighed. "If this goes wrong, Harwell, and we all die because of your pickle jar science project, I'm going to haunt you in the afterlife." Tommy smiled. "Fair enough, Sergeant." Dawn broke cold and gray over the Remagen bridgehead. Fog clung to the ground, but not thick enough to hide the sound of diesel engines and clanking treads. The panzers were coming. Tommy and 11 other men spread out along the trench line, each carrying 2 of Tommy's mason jar smoke bombs. The plan was simple but terrifying. Wait until the tanks were within throwing distance, roughly 30 to 40 yards, then unleash everything at once. The first Panzer appeared through the fog at exactly 6:17 in the morning, then another, then 3 more. 5 tanks in a staggered formation, turrets sweeping back and forth, looking for targets. They were moving slowly, cautiously, expecting resistance but confident in their armor. Sergeant McKinley waited. The tanks rolled closer. 45 yards, 40, 35. "Now!" he screamed. 12 arms swung forward in unison. 23 mason jars arced through the morning air, spinning end over end. Some fell short. A few landed behind the tanks. But 8, maybe 9 of them, hit their targets directly, shattering against turrets, engine decks, and the ground immediately around the panzers. For 1 heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world turned white. The explosions were small, barely louder than a firecracker. But the smoke was instantaneous and overwhelming. It erupted in massive, billowing clouds that engulfed the entire tank formation. Within seconds, all 5 panzers vanished completely from sight. The smoke was so dense it looked solid, like a wall of white fog had materialized out of nowhere. Inside the tanks, chaos. The German crews couldn't see anything, not the American positions, not each other, not even their own instruments. The smoke seeped through every gap and hatch, burning their eyes, filling their lungs, making it impossible to breathe without coughing violently. The lead tank veered hard to the left, blind and panicking, and crashed directly into the 2nd Panzer. The impact was loud enough to echo across the valley. The 3rd tank stopped completely, its commander desperately trying to see through the choking white haze. The 4th and 5th tanks reversed wildly, trying to escape the smoke cloud, but they couldn't coordinate, couldn't communicate, couldn't see where they were going. One panzer backed directly into a drainage ditch and became stuck, its treads spinning uselessly. Another turned so sharply it threw a track and ground to a halt. The smoke kept pouring, kept spreading, and the German tank crews, trained soldiers who had survived years of war, made a decision that probably saved their lives. They bailed out. Hatches flew open. Men stumbled out, coughing, gagging, eyes streaming with tears. They abandoned their tanks and ran, stumbling through the smoke, desperate to get clear of the choking white cloud that had turned their armored advantage into a death trap. The American infantry watched in stunned disbelief. Not a single shot had been fired. Not one bazooka round. Not one artillery shell. And yet, an entire German armored platoon had been neutralized, rendered completely ineffective by mason jars filled with homemade chemicals. Sergeant McKinley turned to Tommy, who was still standing in the trench, watching his creation work exactly as he'd designed it. The sergeant's face was unreadable. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Harwell," he said quietly, "you magnificent, crazy son of a gun." Word spread fast. By that afternoon, every officer in the bridgehead wanted to know about the smoke bombs. By evening, division headquarters was demanding samples. Within a week, chemical warfare specialists from the Army's technical intelligence teams arrived to interview Tommy and analyze his mixture. They were stunned by what they found. His formula was crude, yes, but it was also remarkably effective. The combination of titanium tetrachloride, calcium chloride, zinc compounds, and stabilizing agents created a smoke that was thicker, longer lasting, and more disorienting than anything in the Army's current arsenal. And he'd done it with scavenged materials and basic chemistry knowledge. The men who had mocked him, who had called his jars a joke, who had laughed until they couldn't breathe, now looked at Tommy with something approaching reverence. He wasn't a chemist playing soldier anymore. He was the man who had stopped tanks with mason jars. Captain Brennan put Tommy in charge of manufacturing more of the smoke bombs. Over the next 3 weeks, Tommy and a small team of soldiers produced over 300 units, refining the design, improving the stability, and teaching others how to deploy them effectively. They were used in at least 7 more engagements before the war ended, always with devastating effect. German armor learned to fear the white smoke that came out of nowhere, that turned their advantage into a liability, that forced them to choose between staying blind or abandoning their machines. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Tommy went home to Ohio, back to his chemistry studies, back to a life that seemed impossibly normal after everything he'd seen. He never talked much about the war. When people asked, he usually just shrugged and said he'd done his part. But the Army remembered. In the post-war years, as military strategists studied what had worked and what hadn't in the European theater, Tommy's smoke bombs became a case study, not because they were perfect, they weren't, but because they represented something important: field innovation, soldier ingenuity. The idea that sometimes the best solutions come not from laboratories or generals, but from one person willing to think differently and persist through mockery. Chemical warfare manuals published in the 1950s included sections on improvised smoke weapons, drawing directly from Tommy's work. Training programs began emphasizing the tactical use of smoke not just as concealment, but as an offensive weapon to blind, disorient, and demoralize enemy forces. In 1963, Tommy was invited to speak at the Army Chemical Corps School at Fort McClellan. He was in his early 40s then, a professor at his old college, living a quiet life. He brought one of his original mason jars, preserved all those years, still wrapped in burlap, still marked with his handwritten notes. He told the young officers the same thing he'd told his squad back in that frozen trench in March of '45. Innovation isn't about having the best equipment or the biggest budget. It's about seeing a problem, understanding it deeply, and having the courage to try something everyone else thinks is ridiculous. One young lieutenant raised his hand. "Sir, weren't you afraid? I mean, what if it hadn't worked?" Tommy smiled. "Of course I was afraid, but I was more afraid of watching my friends die because I didn't try. Fear of failure is nothing compared to fear of regret." Today, Tommy's original smoke bombs sit in a display case at the Army Chemical Corps Museum, alongside the stories of soldiers who changed warfare through ingenuity rather than firepower. Most visitors walk past without noticing, but some stop, lean in, read the plaque, and understand. This wasn't a story about a weapon. It was a story about belief, about a young man who knew he was right even when everyone else thought he was crazy, about persistence in the face of mockery, about the courage to build something with your own hands and trust that it would work when it mattered most. In every war, in every conflict, there are moments when doctrine fails, when standard procedure isn't enough, when survival depends on someone willing to improvise, adapt, and overcome. Tommy Harwell was that someone, and for 27 seconds on a foggy morning in March 1945, his mason jars full of homemade smoke proved something that military strategists are still teaching today. Sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield isn't the one that kills. It's the one that takes away your enemy's ability to fight at all. They laughed at his fake smoke, right up until the moment they couldn't see through it. And then, suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore. Think about Tommy's story. Not the tactics or the chemistry, but the heart of it. He saw a problem everyone else accepted as unsolvable. He had an idea everyone else dismissed as worthless, and he built something anyway, knowing he might be wrong, knowing he might be mocked, but believing that trying was better than accepting the status quo. How many times have you had an idea like that? Something that felt right in your gut but looked crazy on paper? Something you didn't try because you were afraid people would laugh? Tommy Harwell teaches us that mockery is often just fear wearing a different face. People laugh at what they don't understand, at what challenges their assumptions, at what makes them uncomfortable. But history isn't made by people who avoid discomfort. It's made by people who lean into it, who build their mason jars and throw them anyway. So here's the question. What's your mason jar? What's the thing you could build, should build, want to build, but haven't because you're worried about what others might say? Maybe it's time to stop waiting for permission, for approval, for everyone else to believe in your vision. Maybe it's time to start mixing the compounds and see what kind of smoke you can make. Because somewhere, right now, there's a problem that needs solving. And the person everyone's going to laugh at today might be the person everyone's going to remember tomorrow. What will you build?